Now I will, introduce our special guest star tonight, Sierles. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming out tonight through the rain and all that. I really appreciate it, and I hope I can keep you entertained at least for 1 hour. So this is supposed to be an intro to React Native, and it says here why React Native. So it's kind of, I tricked you guys a little bit. I don't want to waste your time and just go through the motions of building an app from scratch and showing how to do that, because you can do that on the React Native homepage following a tutorial. We've all done this with all these new technologies. So instead, I'd like to talk a little bit of my experience with React Native from the beginning all the way through to pushing production apps out, and some of the cool stuff I've found about React Native, also some of the not so good stuff I found out about it. So you guys, if you're going to jump into it, are a little bit better prepared for the React Native world. Can I ask how many here are familiar with React.js, just the web React? Okay, quite a few. Cool. And what about just native development on iOS or Android? Oh, okay, good. So it's a good mix, and hopefully this will be useful for all of you. So I'm not going to go too much into what React Native is, because I think we all have an idea, but basically it allows us to build native iOS, Android or Windows Phone apps now using composable components written in JavaScript. This is the base of React Native, and what the intention was to sort of be able to unify native and web development teams who already have experience with JavaScript and building better mobile applications inside Facebook, and now has been open source for the rest of the world to do the same. This may seem unrelated to React Native, but I want to kind of leave you with another idea. I always like to leave some ideas that are unrelated to technology directly, but in my mind are. I love these sort of law shows. This is Law and Order. It's an American show about cops who get the bad guys, and then they take them to court, and this guy, or one of these types of guys, says something like, we have to prove this defendant had motive, opportunity, and the means to commit this crime. This is sort of the base of the American criminal legal system. I like this phrase because I think it kind of represents something about human behavior in general. These are 3 requirements, in most cases, for someone to make a decision. They need to have motive, means, and an opportunity to sort of break through to a decision barrier. And I think a lot of us come to these kind of talks not just because we're curious about the technology, but we're also seeing other people who have already moved into it and kind of wondering if we're left behind or if it's better than some other technology. But often, I think it's good to think with this, use this as a framework to figure out why somebody may have made a decision to use something like React Native or any other technology which are completely valid as much as React Native is for building a mobile application. Just something I want you to kind of think about along the way while we're in this talk, and how you get to this middle point and break through to use a new technology. For me, this all happened because a friend of mine, this was a couple of years ago, wanted to build an app for making noodle soups, like generating random noodle soups. Who loves noodle soup? I do. Who doesn't love noodle soup? Come on. So it seemed like a cool idea, but I was a Ruby on Rails developer at the time, and I had no idea how to build mobile apps. I wasn't even particularly interested in it, but it seemed like a good opportunity, me being between projects. I had the motivation, but I was missing the means. I tried to do some development with Xcode on iOS, a little bit with Android, and to be honest, I failed and could not. My inspiration died out before I could really get far enough to make these apps work the way that I wanted to. Coming from the web world, it was just too different for me. But then React Native came out, right at this point, like light from the sky, and these guys from Facebook just showed a video of how React Native works, and I thought this is a great opportunity to break through and jump on this new technology. So I made a soup app. So I want to talk a little bit about this app and this other app. This is the last thing that I worked on, which I'm pretty proud of. The product worked on with this great team of developers called Hanno, CEO. They develop, design, and prototype products. If you need a prototype, get in touch with these guys. In 2 months, with 3 developers, we built an app for iOS and Android with quite a lot of complexity. And I think it's a really powerful demonstration of what React Native is capable of. It'll be out in the app stores in a couple of weeks, hopefully. So we'll see some examples from these applications of what we can do with React Native. Just so you know, this app is a companion for a lunchbox. So instead of eating out, cook some food, put it in the containers, take the lunchbox to work, and you have an app that you can use to tell you what to cook and keep track of your nutrition and so on. So that was what the idea of this app was, and we'll see why it was necessary. So I just want to cover quickly some of the good things and then also good things about the React Native framework. Well, I really see React Native as more than just a tool for building mobile apps. Is sort of a complement to the entire JavaScript and React ecosystem, which already was pretty big, and now is huge. If you see on GitHub and everywhere else, JavaScript is everywhere. React is pretty hot right now, and React Native is really just an extension of this ecosystem. Well, not all, but many of the tools that you can use with React Web are usable with React Native, and the concepts are reusable as well as the tools. So this is a great thing. React Native was built as a mobile-first environment, so it was built multi-threaded. And this is a very important point, which we'll get to later when we're talking about performance in applications. Something that you may be able to compare with Cordoba-based applications, which were not designed with this multi-threading in mind. Another great thing is web developers, especially today with all the tools that have come out since React Native was created a year and a half ago, on day one can be building out native views, navigation, and really whatever you're inspired to do, you probably will get done very quickly with just the knowledge that you have of JavaScript, and maybe even not having knowledge of React.js. In my case, I learned React.js through React Native, so I went the other way around, and it worked out pretty well. Another great thing is that React Native doesn't require you to go all in. You can gradually introduce it to existing native applications. There's instructions right on the React Native website on how to do this, and it's being done in production by a lot of apps that you're probably using today have little chunks of React Native inside them that you may not even notice. So this is a really cool thing about React Native as well. But above all, in my opinion, the thing that motivates me to use it even more so today than ever is such a strong open source community around it that's being backed by these big players like Facebook. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. And we have a dedicated, really smart open source team working full time on improving React Native's not only the components that are available to you to build apps, but in performance and all levels of development of the framework. That said, there's a few other things that aren't so great about this framework now, and we should talk about them. The scope of native development is pretty wide and deep. As those of you working in native environments on a daily basis know, there's a lot more APIs to deal with than on the web. There's a platform disparity is huge across all the different native platforms. Even the basic concept of how to lay out a screen are completely different between Android and iOS, and the tooling we're using today on the native side is very different. So these are the problems that Facebook had set out to solve. Async programming is hard, at least for me in my brain. Kind of just has one loop going in there, and in React Native, we have another level of asynchronicity, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which we have to deal with and can make it difficult to make decisions about how to build our more complex UIs. I don't know if you've heard this phrase before. How many people have heard this phrase over the last couple of months? Okay, so this is a bit of a cliche in the JavaScript world, and I don't want to repeat cliches, but cliches have some truth in them, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be cliches. And there is something going on there. And JavaScript is such a huge ecosystem. In React Native, you really do feel the pain of that. And the React Native core has over 1,000 dependencies inside it. And like half of them come from a tool that's used just to generate some JavaScript templates. So there's a lot of work going on to try to eliminate these dependencies and combine them. But coming from a native environment, this can be very frustrating, where there tend to be a lot fewer dependencies of this type and tooling that makes it a little bit easier to reason about what's going to happen inside your application. In the JavaScript world, this is not the case yet. And then there's just the reality of the mobile environment. If you're coming from the web world, all the tooling that you're going to run into, even with React Native tools that abstract away a lot of the dirty parts of the native world, you're going to have to get into Xcode, Android Studio, into the Android configuration files. You're going to have to understand these kinds of things to really be able to work in the React Native environment and push things into production. And there's also dealing with different kinds of gestures, the long presses, competing gestures, and different user habits that mobile device users have ourselves. Maybe you don't think about it when you're using an app, but when I designed this, the Soup app I was talking about before, people were just trying to drag stuff and Tinder swipe it, and I didn't add any behavior of this kind in there, but that was what people were expecting. So there's a lot of expectations in mobile that maybe on the web we don't think about as much. Plus tons of devices that our app may not even work on one device and another that are running the same operating system. And last of all, parity between all these platforms in React Native currently is not near 100%, not even with the components that it comes built in to React Native. So we have to be aware that even basic things like text inputs or buttons are not always going to work the same on both platforms, and we have to be aware of what kinds of properties are supported on these different platforms. For those of you that are not familiar with React.js, I don't want to sort of go into description of what it is, because it's too much scope there, and it is one of the most powerful things about React Native, but this is how I would describe it. As being composable UI elements that describe themselves, if they're coded correctly, and guide you to the other components in your application. So it makes it very easy to reason about what's happening inside your UI. We can see an example here of what a typical button element would look like in a React Native application, where it's just a function that we are able to extend. We give it some default styles, but we can pass in properties that allow us to extend these styles and change them as necessary throughout our application. So components that are composable. We don't have to go over what all this means, but I just wanted you to get an idea of what a typical component may look like. But I really want to talk about those, the feeling of what it's like to develop a React Native application. Coming from the web, we're used to this sort of layout, styling, and reloading loop, which is really fast. And the great thing about the web is that we can just write some HTML, CSS in a file, load it up, and just reload instantly and see changes. This is something we take for granted. And in the native development world, that's not always the case. And having to recompile things often pushes back on our inspiration when we want to do experimentation with UI prototyping. So React Native also has helped us solve this problem by coming up with a really cool idea, which was something called CSS layout. So I took this from the documentation because it describes perfectly what it is. It allows developers for web, Android, iOS, and Windows to use the same layout primitives across all platforms. And those primitives basically are built around the Flexbox. Who's using Flexbox now on the web? Okay, good. So Flexbox is a new, relatively new implementation of layout system, which Facebook found ideal for laying out mobile screens, especially because we're not dealing with browsers that have to be resized all the time. So Flexbox is actually the basis for the entire layout system inside React Native, and from my opinion, one of the most powerful things about the framework. We can break out of Flexbox using absolute positioning just like we do on the web, and we're writing our CSS as we would call it, the re-implementation of CSS in JavaScript using the similar naming from CSS. So coming from the web world, you can be very comfortable working with our views inside React Native. So just an example for Flexbox, for those of you who haven't used it, a common problem on the web is something really silly, is centering something in the middle of the screen or in the middle of another element. This is all you have to do in Flexbox to make that happen. And if we're doing it in React Native, it looks like this. So the transition from the styling perspective is very similar. And in our experience for the actual development, here we have a text editor with some Flexbox styles. We're defining these elements, what direction that they should be displayed in, and what kind of padding we have around them. And this is an iOS simulator that's running on a Mac. So the typical React Native development experience is just changing these values, adding some padding, changing the direction of rendering of these items to columns instead of rows, and saving the file, and then in about a second our UI gets updated automatically. So basically the same as on the web, but in a completely native environment. So this is amazing thing, which was the first thing that React Native did really well, and in my opinion just continues to be the thing that makes it a great tool to use. The way this works is we have a Node.js server that's running on your computer in the background, that's processing requests. It's a web server that's processing requests for assets, and actually it's compiling your JavaScript in real time and serving it into the native application that's running the React Native code on the simulator. This, of course, works on a device as well, so your device can access the web server that's running on your computer if it's on the same network. So developing right on a device as well and feeling the real native behavior is a totally normal thing that happens in React Native development on a daily basis. Some of the UI components that we have available to us are been built around the actual native components inside iOS and Android. For example, date pickers or scroll views, text inputs. This doesn't seem like anything special, but this actually has been quite a challenge for this team because there's so many differences between these platforms. So little by little, these elements are being released by the core Facebook team. However, around all of this, there's a huge open source community of UI components, also ones that are not built on the native implementations, but built on purely in JavaScript. And so we have these options that we can choose from and trade-offs between each of them. The native implementations like these may have properties that are available in iOS, but not on Android, whereas some of the JavaScript ones are available, will have these properties that are should work similarly in both environments. A good example of this is navigation, which is probably one of the trickiest things in mobile development, because we're not just clicking around URLs. We don't have an addressable space anymore to work with. So what are we working with? Now we're working with hierarchies of screens, where once we get past these areas where we just have one screen, we're going left, right here, we're pulling things up, but underneath all these screens are still there. They're not disappearing from memory, and they have to be dealt with in a different way than we do on the web. But on the previous slide, I put a URL for a library that is written purely in JS and uses the animation API provided by React Native to give us a lot of this stuff for free, a lot of these transitions that you saw when they feel very native in their behavior. So this is something I would recommend using right away if you're going to be jumping into React Native development. But sometimes beyond these types of UI elements, we need something more specific, like this last app with the Lunchbox needed access to the Apple Health Kit native API, so we could input the nutritional data from these lunchboxes into the Health Kit and make it available to other applications. And this, in the beginning with React Native, was quite a challenge, because we had to find this native SDK, integrate it with our application inside of Xcode or in Android Studio, and manually do all of this work. And some great tooling has come out since then with React Native that allows plugin authors to distribute their plugins with iOS and Android extensions built into the NPM package. So literally all we have to do to make it work in our application with native access is install it and run this command. So as long as the plugin follows the conventions provided by Facebook, this works. So, and this worked for us in this application. With a few small modifications, we were able in one day to have full native access to Apple Health Kit, which is also a great example of how the bridging between the JavaScript and the native side in React Native is simpler than one might think if you've dealt with these kind of things in Cordova or other types of environments where it's a lot more complicated to get things like this done. This site is a great place to find some of these extensions, which are really useful. Vector icons, for example, is an extremely useful package which gives you native access to a huge set of icons, all vector rendered, so they can render any size and looks nice, and has been around for a long time, so it's very stable. Plus for video playback, audio recording from the camera, and many other things have already been built out and have been working for a while. So definitely take a look here if you have some ideas about apps that you want to build, see if there are plugins that are already available for you. I do want to talk a bit about how React Native works underneath, this concept of the JavaScript and native bridge, because this is really the key to what React Native is about. And all of it is predicated on this multi-threading concept I mentioned before, where we have three main threads. Well, I don't want to use the word main. We have three threads. We have one thread that starts up when the application initializes, both on Android and iOS, where we have a JavaScript core VM running a loop, and this is where our JavaScript code executes. And we have another thread, which is where our UI layer is calculated before going to the main UI thread, which is the thread that native developers are familiar with, where all of your UI is actually drawn on the screen. This shady UI area, if you're familiar with React.js, is similar to the virtual DOM on the web. So we can almost think of iOS, Android, and the DOM, their layout systems, as implementation details, all working under the same system. And this multi-threading gives us the ability to do work on our JavaScript thread without interrupting things that are happening on the UI thread. And this is crucial for making sure our applications feel performant and not janky and not getting stuck when you're scrolling up and down, like what happens on a lot of mobile web applications. Plus, each native module, like the Apple HealthKit module or modules that you write yourself, extensions to SDKs you might be using that don't exist yet for React Native, get their own thread as well. So you can communicate directly with those from the JavaScript thread without interrupting anything that's happening on the UI. So again, there's a lot of safety here in keeping your application feeling native. So another point I wanted to make just about the community is it's not. This is a site that GitHub put out that talks about the sort of universe of GitHub and the state that it's in today, what projects are popular and in what way. And I thought it was very interesting that React Native pops up all over this page, but particularly in these two areas. Most open source contributors and most users reviewing code. And I think this one in particular really interests me. Not the contents of the list, but the fact that it's on there, and that this is a measurement that really matters to us today. And it really matters to me, because it means if I'm contributing to React Native, I know other people are going to review my code, and I know that there's a pretty strong community of people there that are working on a daily basis to improve the tools that I'm using. I think this is one of the most important things we have to think about when using new technologies. So there are a few tricky bits in React Native, as any of you who have been using it for a little bit might have run into, and I want to mention them even for those of you who have no experience with it, because it's good to know kind of where you're going to start hitting walls and to know what possibilities exist to overcome some of these obstacles. So one area is animation. This is probably the biggest one, because this is what mobile UIs are really all about. Differing from perhaps web applications, we have a lot more animation because we have more gestures. We're doing more things on the device, so we have to deal with what happens, what the feedback is going to be like on these. So these animations have to be more performant and more reactive than on the web. And this is an area that React Native has been struggling with from the beginning, because we have this disparity between the JavaScript thread and the main UI thread. This bridge that runs between them is fast, but it's not infinitely fast. There's always going to be cases where events passing between the two may not be fast enough to deal with the kinds of work that we're doing on the JavaScript thread or on the main UI thread. Take the example of this app. We have this animation where we're just scrolling up and down, and you can see that these containers are sort of moving a little bit up and down when we scroll. So this kind of animation is very simple to implement using an animation API provided by React Native. It's a very powerful API in the right situations, which is a quick example of how it might look. You can ask questions about this later, but the basic concepts we get set a special value in JavaScript, which is an animated value, and that the value controls the animation of the thing that we see in the UI. And we can attach that and set that value based on other values. So in this case, the scrolling of this view that we've been looking at is an event coming from the native thread and coming back to the JavaScript side. So this is an event that's firing quite often because we're scrolling fast and we want to know what this offset position is. We're setting that position to the original value that we saw above, and later on that value can be used to change any part of the state of your UI that you want, which in the case of the application I showed you, it looks pretty smooth and clean, but there are many cases where that's not going to be the case. If, like for example, all of this data that's loading off of this in this application is offline. It's all inside of a JSON file. All of the images are already inside the application. Nothing's loading off of the internet. So there's nothing really happening on the JavaScript thread that's going to interrupt this control of this animation. But if you're doing any kind of work on this list where the typical infinite scrolling, where you're loading some products off of your website's API and loading images provided by users, doing a lot more work on that JavaScript thread, you can easily have these animations interrupted and start to see some poor performance. And this is a problem that thankfully Facebook has started working on. They're just on the new version of React Native that's coming out now, are releasing a new implementation of their animation API, which will allow you to offload this particular animation, this particular native event of the scroll, to the native side. So when you write your animation code, it actually gets translated to the native side, and you don't have to keep sending messages back and forth between JavaScript and the native side. So hopefully with the other types of animations and other types of events, they will be implementing this to increase the possibility that your app is going to be as smooth as possible. That said, there's always trade-offs here that you don't see when in native development, and it's worth thinking about them when you have a complicated UI. The other tricky bit is gesture handling. We're coming back again here because in this app, you can't see it here because you can't see where I'm tapping, but you can actually scroll here by scrolling in the middle and also scrolling on the horizontally at the top there. And you can scroll up and down on these lists to see the different lunchboxes that are in each list. So what happens here when you're scrolling a little bit too much vertically or a little bit too much horizontally, you have a lot of gesture responders in your application that are trying to take control of that gesture and say, I want to go this way, and another one saying, no, we should be scrolling up, and the other one saying, no, we should be changing something at the top of the screen, and this kind of thing can get out of control very quickly. In fact, implementing this was not a simple task, figuring out the right math, something that I think is pretty common on native development. Still is a problem in React Native because just the nature of how gesture responders work. That said, there are hopefully going to be improvements here as well in the near future, giving deeper access into the native side of gesture handling. If anyone has more questions about that, please ask later on. Another tricky area with React Native is background execution. So this is like when your app goes in the background and you're playing music on Spotify, or you have a Uber tracking your ride. There's just more and more applications are running in the background, tracking things, doing a lot of work. And one big problem with React Native, at least on iOS, is that the JavaScript thread stops running in the background. So any work that you're doing there is just going to stop. Any data you're fetching, any calculations, anything at all. So this is a big problem for these types of applications. If you want to write most of your, for example, geolocation tracking code on the JavaScript side, and the application goes into the background in someone's pocket, and you're not tracking anything. So how do we deal with this problem? Right now, thankfully, there are some plugins that solve this problem by pushing all the work onto the native side. So it's just a matter of putting more work into a native plugin and then passing that data back over to the application once it wakes up. So what we do get from React Native is the ability to know when the application has gone to sleep and when it's woken back up on the JavaScript thread, and we're still able to receive data back through callbacks. But during that time while it's sleeping, we still don't have a solution for writing cross-platform code that will make that work. So this plugin for geolocation, it's a really cool plugin. If you search React Native geolocation background, you'll find it, and it works really well. But it's huge chunks of native code, and they're completely different on Android and on iOS. So it's kind of the work that if you had to do it yourself, you would need a lot of native expertise on both platforms to implement it well. So this is something to think about as well if you need background work like timers. If you're writing a metronome app that needs to just have a beat playing in the background, that also you're going to have to implement all the timing stuff on the back end on the native side in Java and in Objective-C or Swift. So again, these are the kind of things that we have to think about for background execution. But one positive note, getting back onto the positive things, React Native is the huge possibility for code reuse, something that's already happening a lot today in the React.js world, and even more so now with React Native, is that all of the libraries that have nothing to do with the UI or the native side of manipulating, working with the sensor data, or cameras and so on, all of these tools now are compatible with React Native. So we have, for example, the Soup app I mentioned. This is a web version, which I'd say 95% of this code is shared from the React Native application. So first, after having built the React Native application, writing all the code in JavaScript to generate the soup, make sure it's a tasty soup and not a nasty soup. That's a lot of code in there to make that work. And even some of the UI code for layering these PNGs and so on is all shared and deployed from the same repository, just using JavaScript npm tasks. So this is really cool, and something that not too long ago would have been a big pain in the ass to make happen. So there's a lot more opportunity for code reuse than just this kind of thing. Something we were talking about earlier with the team here today was how it might actually be possible to use the existing Vue code from React Native and translate it to web. So almost using the React Native Vue layout system as the core for everything that you're writing, and then forgetting about divs and all the native HTML that you know on the website, and just using the React Native Vue code and figuring out how far we can take that. Twitter has been doing some experiments with that. One application I worked on actually was built this way, sharing a few specific views that had to be viewed on a mobile device in a browser, and all of the styles and everything were shared at the UI level, not just at the data manipulation level. So this was also a big time saver, and something I think that gives the React Native an edge. There's a missing part to this whole conversation, which is like, how do we deal with data, and something that has come up with all the conversations I have about React Native. It's a huge topic, something we can't really get into right now, but I want you to think about these, or at least research these 4 libraries if you don't know about them yet. 3 out of 4 of them were developed either at Facebook or by somebody who was employed by Facebook, who's slowly eating up the entire JavaScript ecosystem, which I think is a good thing. I'm saying this is a good thing because they're doing great work. Redux and MobX are tools that help us manage state inside React Native across all of our views. If you're familiar with how this works in React.js, the same exact thing works in React Native. It gives us the ability to reason about all of the state of our whole application in one place, and also share that across web application and both of our React Native platforms. There are different approaches. One is more immutable, functional, and another one is, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's worth looking at both of these options for state management inside your application. And then we have GraphQL and Relay, which are 2 really cool. GraphQL itself is a new way of thinking about data in general, of accessing APIs, and something that's pretty tightly coupled to the React ecosystem. I'm not going to describe it, but check it out. It's very cool. And Relay is a declarative data fetcher that works with this GraphQL API implementation. So just check out these things and keep them in mind, because if you're going to be working in the React Native world, these tools are going to come up a lot, and I found from personal experience they really give you an edge when dealing with new ways of accessing data. So this is another thing that's come up a lot, and there's a lot of hype around React Native of updating apps that are already in production without going through the App Store review process. This is something that came up a lot when React Native came out, and has actually pushed that concept to the forefront of mobile development in a really positive way, because now there's hundreds of apps in the App Store on your phone that are probably updating finally without going through the App Store, which could be a good or bad thing depending on how you think about it. But for us as developers, this is a lifesaver. As you think about it, all the React Native application is a JavaScript file and some assets that are being loaded by a native application on your phone. So that file, when you distribute your app to production, is just sitting on the storage on the device. But you can also access it from anywhere, right, over the internet. So there are actual tools that allow us in production, once we pushed our app out, to release new versions of our JavaScript and of assets that come along with it, images, any other types of assets inside your application, without going through the Google Play Store or the App Store. And this is really a lifesaver for beta testing and for fixing bugs, all sorts of things. This really gives you a huge edge when working in production with mobile apps. And can we guess who built one of the coolest tools for doing this? These guys. And this is also a great thing, I think, about, there's so much talk now about comparing frameworks and which one's the best and which ones should I choose. It's because I don't know which one's going to last. And in the end, all this stuff is coming together. Microsoft has its own native Xamarin. It's its own mobile development framework for cross-platform development. But at the same time, they have a really cool open source team building this tool for React Native and for Cordoba apps. So if we think about it, we shouldn't really be thinking about this as a competition or having to choose one of these technologies or another, but rather, again, if you have the means, motive, and opportunity to just jump into one or the other, you'll find a lot of these are starting to converge around, especially around the JavaScript ecosystem. I want to mention another cool tool which I built with some of the core team when React Native came out. I'll let one of the creatives of React describe it. Let's see if we can understand what he says. Okay, let me try this again. Well, it doesn't matter. Basically, he said something with a really heavy French accent saying, there's this really cool tool where we can play around with React Native code on a website and load it in a simulator on the web. So this is an actual I/O simulator that's being streamed from a Mac somewhere, and we can make a change the code here. Just hit Control S, and the app is going to reload in real time, and we'll see the change there. And we can load this same app on an Android device as well and see the same changes. So this is like just a cool idea that we had. So would it be possible to just load all of the JavaScript remotely in real time with a streaming device? And there's a company called Appetize.io, which you definitely should check out. I should have put them on the slide, but I didn't. But Appetize, they're the ones who provided this streaming interface for free, but you can also purchase it and use it. It's a great tool that has a bunch of Android and iOS devices for doing QA testing and things like that. You just upload your app there and it works. And this tool is actually based on another one that I mentioned a couple times in this talk, which is Exponent. And actually, this is the thing that if you're going to get into React Native today and you have no experience with it yet, I think this is the best place to start. These guys are a crack team, really smart guys. outside of Facebook, but some of them had worked in Facebook previously and are probably the most knowledgeable with the core of React Native today and the challenges faced by it. So what they did is they created an app, like, I can try to describe it. They do a better job than I do. But basically, they have an app that's already on the App Store, which is just like a core of React Native with nothing else but the ability to load React Native application JavaScript from the internet. So what this gives us the ability to do is to actually develop React Native applications without Xcode, Android, well, anything. Just if you have a device, you can just download the app right now, start playing around with React Native apps, download their XDE, which is their sort of development environment, which works on Windows and on Macs. And with just text editor, you can start building React Native applications. They have a bunch of native extensions already built in and are adding more and more. So I think this is a great way to start out with React Native and feeling the power of it. Plus, it's a great prototyping environment because we can use this app that's on our phone, have a client install that app, and just send them a URL which will actually open your prototype directly on their phone. So you can start prototyping an app, and later on in the day send them a URL, and they have it running natively on their device with all of the same native behavior that you have in your development environment. So this is a really cool tool, which has a lot of future in React Native. Plus, it's open source. Not just all of the JavaScript elements that they've built, but the native client itself. So it's a great place if you're looking to contribute to React Native. I think this would be the place to do it. Contribute native code to this piece of software, so more people have access to more of the native APIs on the devices. So that's it pretty much. I wanted to get questions from you guys and see what you want to know about. Do we have a mic? Yes. But I think they're streaming, so maybe with the mic, people can.
Yeah. About the gestures that you mentioned, that there are some limitations. Yes. I would be interested to know what are those.
Okay, so well, there's a component that's called a pan responder, which is the tool that is given to you by React Native to handle these gestures. So you have events coming over from the native side, giving you things like the position of touch, the velocity, and so on. The problem is when you have multiple touches and you have a lot of things going on in the application, again, like scrolling and multiple touches, it's the same limitation that I was mentioning before with the JavaScript native bridge not being able to keep up. With gestures, it's the same issue because scrolling is also a gesture. So that's one of the issues, and that when you have a lot of work happening on your JavaScript thread, it's possible for gestures to get lost and to feel some lag in gestures when you're moving, if you're dragging things around, for example, because when you're dragging things around, you're getting these callbacks coming from the native side, and you're responding to them. And if you in JavaScript, but if your JavaScript thread is also loading things off the network or doing other intensive work, then the resolution of those events drops. And when you drop that resolution, you start to see changes in the behavior of the UI or feel it being laggy. So that's one of the issues. And the other is just the pan responder doesn't give you enough flexibility on deciding which view on the screen is going to be responding to the gesture at the time. At least from this is a part that I understand less about because I haven't worked with gestures on the native side. But if I understand that there's more control over which part of your UI hierarchy is going to be responding to that gesture, where in React Native you're more limited because of the way that the layout is built on that shadow queue that I mentioned, because that's where all that calculation is happening. So there's some discussion now, which are definitely a good place to look is in the React Native repository in issues or pull requests. There's some really good really discussions about these particular problems from the core team, and we'll give you some more insight into kind of what ideas are of how to improve it.
Can I make another one?
Yeah.
So a couple of months ago, I tried getting into React Native a bit. The truth is, I was turned away by JavaScript.
Yes.
So sorry, web developers.
Understandable.
While the overall framework seemed nice, JavaScript was me.
Right.
And my question is, I've seen that there are some attempts to make it work with TypeScript.
With AppScript.
TypeScript.
TypeScript, yes.
Which is more appealing to me, at least.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few implementations that people have been working on with experimentally anyway, with Elm, ClojureScript, and TypeScript. So there are experiments there. I haven't personally used any of these, but I do think there are going to. I know a couple of these are working in production. Like ClojureScript, I think, is probably the environment that's most advanced as a sort of wrapper around React Native. But in the end, you're still kind of dealing with the JavaScript ecosystem. Just you're not writing in JavaScript, but you're still dealing with all the dependencies that are underneath it. That said, I think these are perfectly viable approaches, and I think they're good. The project I'm working on right now, which is a web-based one, is using ClojureScript on top of React, and it does avoid a lot of those kinds of problems. That said, JavaScript is modernizing itself little by little, and every time you jump into it, there's a new feature there. Just so people know what I'm talking about, with there's a curious thing about JavaScript is that there's a lot of features that aren't implemented in the runtimes out there, but are available through a transpiler called Babel, which is also built by someone who works at Facebook. And React Native itself is pretty dependent on this tool, and it's something that I think is. I share your concerns, and that I think it's a great way to sort of prototype changes to a language and introduce them gradually, but it also creates a lot of confusion about how to even write the language in the first place. If you look at the documentation of React Native, half of the examples are written with classes, the other half are written with functions. So there are a lot of issues around the JavaScript fatigue that I think haven't been solved yet, and I hope they will, or everyone moves to TypeScript.
Yeah, thank you for talk. Small question. So, small background first. Initially, React Native was developed just for iOS, and Android was added a bit later. And for Android, some APIs are basically missing, and some properties are missing for some components. Have you ever encountered this, and how you've dealt with the problem that something is actually here for iOS and
yes.
not?
Yes, yeah, and that's I probably should have emphasized that more in the not so good section, with lack of platform parity is basically what I meant, but there's more to it, like you're saying. There really are quite a lot of differences even now, though there is a lot of work both on the core team and in people who are writing extensions for React Native to improve that parity. So there's two problems. One is that some of these components don't share properties that they just haven't been implemented yet, like adding shadow on text or something like that, something that can be done but hasn't been done yet. So that's one side of things where you kind of just have to jump in and do it yourself. They definitely require having a bit of a hustler mentality working with React Native if you are truly committed to doing a cross-platform application and you want all of the behavior to work that way. There's a really interesting talk from these guys at the React Europe conference on their blog. There's a link to it about very specific problems that they had writing an application for Android instead of for iOS. They wrote directly for Android to deal head-on with all these kinds of problems and discuss in detail how they dealt with them. And personally, in my case, I found that it's kind of a trade-off, because you do run into a lot of these platform parity problems where you have to write some code to make up for what's missing on Android that's already on iOS. But in a lot of the cases, it's made up for by the development time that you save for the other 90% of the application, which does work well. So for these points, for example, this animation I was showing with sliding containers, this thing is proving to be a little more troublesome on on Android. Particularly the animation API right now on Android is a lot less stable than it is on iOS. But for example, the geolocation works really well on Android. So this is one of the walls you will hit, and I think the long-term solution is for people who want to do mobile development are to become cross-stack developers and just start digging into the native side of things if you haven't been there yet. I haven't found it as scary as I thought it would be. Coming from the web, working through React Native, I've learned quite a lot about the native environments and built my own extensions for specific things that I needed. And by doing that, I think you can feel more secure in developing with a framework like this, knowing that at least kind of where to start when you deal with these kinds of platform disparities.
Thanks. One more question, okay. Is there anything that you really miss in React Native that you really want to see but it's not here yet?
I miss, well, coming from the web and not from native development, I wouldn't say there's things I miss specifically about mobile. But what I would like to see from the React Native team at Facebook is more transparency about the direction that they're taking, because they're a really good team and all of them are really smart guys, and there's a dedicated team to open source. But for example, in Facebook, they have a system by which the people on the open source teams I don't know how often, but have to move off of the team and work on a product for a month, which is a good thing because it gives them direct access to all the real problems that they have in their products, but also can mean whatever they're working on stops at that point. And there are some people on that team who are solely responsible for big chunks of the core. So having a little bit more transparency about the directions that they plan to take, I think would help a lot for the people who are depending on the framework. That said, of course, the more open source contributions that come in, the better. The more people who are involved with it, the more pressure there will be on that core team to bring in elements that are missing, like supporting more properties that are missing, or improving the quality of maps library, for example. But it's the same with any open source community. I think there has to be contributions and there has to be pressure, not just expectations. So yeah, I just would like to see more transparency there.
Thanks.
Yeah. I would just like to ask is, so you've been implementing native apps before, and now you implemented using React Native. Did you, and some time back, understand when you should implement a native app, or when you should use React Native, or you think that will be totally replaced by React Native?
Well, to clarify that, I didn't come from native development. I came from the web side of things more so. So I couldn't say I couldn't say it from that perspective. But I don't think you have to make this choice. And one thing that's great about React Native is this bridging environment, which I would have liked if we had more time to show how it actually works, how this callback system works between the native and the JavaScript thread. It's quite ingenious and simple, and it's very easy to learn. So I think that coupled with the fact that at any point where you're finding that the environment that React Native is giving you is not giving you the fidelity that you need, or you're using some kind of existing UI component that comes from an SDK that already has its own system. A good example is an app I was building that has a driver license scanning tool, which is a very complex thing. There was no point in re-implementing it. And integrating it into React Native took maybe 2 days' work of one developer who never had never worked with Android before and built an Android bridge for it. Because really what it allows you to do is bridge just the things that you need from the native side. It doesn't require you to re-implement an entire library. And that also includes views, things that are being displayed on the screen, not just APIs like geolocation. You can embed views from the native side inside React Native and vice versa. So I don't think it's a decision that has to even be made. I think it's good that all of these things exist in parallel.
Okay, thank you.